In our devotional series, we've been looking at faith essentials and what faith essentials basically means. Those essential characteristics or qualities that we should have in our lives, regardless of what we're going through or our circumstances or even the virus that we might be facing. And so today we want to look at another of those qualities. But before we look at our verse, what I'd like to do is to kind of paint the context for you first. In Mark chapter 11 and 12, Jewish leaders have been coming up to Jesus and they've been trying to trick him with certain questions. And there was one religious leader who was listening to Jesus, and he saw that Jesus was giving all the right answers to all the questions that he was being asked. And so in verse 28 of chapter 12, this religious leader finally blurts out his question. I think that it was a legitimate question that he had. It was something that was on his mind, something that had been bothering him for a long time. And so Mark writes this. He says, "And one of the scribes came up and heard him disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, 'Which commandment is the most important of all?'" And so he asks Jesus, "What is the most important commandment that I should be following?" Now remember that this person was a teacher of the law. He knew the Old Testament. He had been teaching the Old Testament. And so by asking that question, I think that he really had another question behind it. I think what he was really asking was, what's the most important thing in life? Jesus, I teach the Old Testament. I go through my lectures. I try to live my life by obeying all the laws of the Old Testament. But I get to the place in my life when I just ask myself, isn't there more to life than this? And so what I'm asking you, Jesus, is what is the meaning of life? What's the most important thing that I should be focusing on in life so my life has meaning? And so Jesus answers and he says, if you want to know what the main thing in life is, it's this. He says in verse 30 and 31, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And so what Jesus is saying in this verse here is that the most important thing, the main thing that we should be concerned about in our life is that we love God with our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And what he's saying by that is that every faculty that we have should reflect our affection for him. The four faculties that he mentions here, heart, soul, strength, and mind, represent our whole being. And so what he's saying here is that our whole being should demonstrate love for God all the time. Now, loving God with all our faculties is basically saying that we should treasure God, or we should value God above everything else. Now, there are other good things in our lives that we could also love. Jesus is not saying that we can't love other things. We can love our spouse, we can love our children, we can love sports, we can love our cat, our dog, our job, our house. There's all kinds of things that we can love as well. But what Jesus is saying here, we just may not love these things or treasure them in place of God. That is his point. If one of our faculties, our heart, our soul, our strength, our mind, finds its greatest joy or its greatest satisfaction or its greatest pleasure in someone or something other than God, then we're missing the main thing. You see, ultimately we're controlled by the thing that we love or we value most in our lives. We're controlled by what our hearts most adore, what our hearts praise, what our hearts most value. And so you really can't change in your life unless you change what you love first. You can do all the willpower stuff, you can go to seminars, you can do the workshops and the programs and so on, but all these things are just going to bring about temporary or superficial change in your life. Unless you change ultimately what you love, you cannot really truly change. And Jesus wants to have that top position in our lives. Now, in our culture, this is something very hard for us to do because everything in our culture tells us the opposite, to go the opposite direction. We're to find our love, we're to find our satisfaction, our joy, our happiness in ourselves and our possessions, in other people. But what God is looking for here, he's looking for people who are so infatuated with him that they're willing to live counterculturally to all of that.